September 1943. Lieutenant Karl Weber circled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 28,000 feet over the German countryside, and the morning sun glinted off his canopy as he spotted what looked like a formation of fat, lumbering American fighters climbing toward him through the scattered clouds below. Weber actually laughed out loud in his oxygen mask. The new American planes looked like flying milk jugs, thick and bulky with massive radial engines that made them seem more like cargo haulers than fighters, and he'd already shot down 31 Allied aircraft in the past 18 months. This was going to be easy. He radioed his wingman with barely concealed amusement, telling him to watch how quickly these clumsy American planes would fall from the sky when German precision and speed met American bulk and desperation. His wingman, a young pilot named Hans Kruger who'd only been with the squadron for 3 weeks, responded with nervous laughter because he trusted Weber's experience and couldn't imagine these awkward-looking planes posing any real threat to the legendary Luftwaffe. Weber had every reason to feel confident that morning because the Luftwaffe had dominated European skies since 1939, and his Messerschmitt was the fastest, most agile fighter plane Germany had ever built, proven in combat from Poland to Russia to the skies over Britain. He'd personally witnessed German fighters tear through Polish biplanes like wolves through sheep, watched Spitfires fall burning from British skies, and seen Soviet fighters scatter in terror when the Bf 109s appeared. The Messerschmitt could climb faster, turn tighter, and outmaneuver anything the Allies had thrown at them for 4 years. Weber's squadron had shot down over 200 Allied planes in the past year alone, and they'd lost only 18 pilots in return, which seemed like acceptable odds in a war where Germany was fighting the entire world. His aircraft was a masterpiece of German engineering, sleek and deadly, with a top speed of 380 miles per hour and a climb rate that could take him from ground level to 30,000 feet in under 10 minutes. Then one of those fat American planes rolled inverted and dove straight at him. Weber's smile disappeared. The dive was impossibly steep and impossibly fast for something that looked so heavy, and the American pilot was coming down at an angle that should have ripped the wings off any normal fighter. The sound reached him next, and it wasn't the sound he expected. Not the light chatter of rifle-caliber guns that he'd grown accustomed to from British Spitfires and American P-51s. Something deeper. Something that made his entire cockpit vibrate and his instruments rattle on their mounts. His wingman's plane just exploded, transformed from a sleek fighter into a spinning ball of flame and debris in less than 2 seconds. And Weber's hands went ice cold on the control stick as he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Kruger didn't even have time to scream over the radio. One moment he was there, flying perfect formation off Weber's right wing. The next moment there was nothing but burning wreckage tumbling toward the earth below, and Weber was alone in the sky with these American monsters that suddenly didn't look clumsy at all. And here's the thing, this story gets even more insane. So if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week. And trust me, what happens next will blow your mind. What Weber didn't know as he threw his Messerschmitt into a desperate turn was that each P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns that could collectively fire 600 to 400 rounds per minute. And over the next 20 months these planes that German pilots mockingly called jugs would shoot down 3,752 enemy aircraft while losing far fewer of their own. This is the story of how the Luftwaffe learned they'd mocked the wrong airplane, and how American industrial might turned the sky over Europe into a shooting gallery where German pilots became the hunted instead of the hunters. The Germans had good reasons to laugh when they first saw P-47s appearing over Europe in early 1943, because these planes looked absolutely wrong for air combat in every possible way. They weighed 7 tons empty, almost twice what a Messerschmitt weighed, and that massive Pratt Whitney radial engine in the nose made them look like flying barrels with wings bolted on as an afterthought. The cockpit sat so far back that pilots joked they needed binoculars to see the propeller, and the whole aircraft had the aerodynamic grace of a brick with a fan attached to it. German intelligence officers studied reconnaissance photos and decided these new American fighters were probably ground attack planes. Too slow and heavy for dogfighting, maybe useful for shooting up trains and trucks, but certainly no threat to the nimble Bf 109s and FW 190s that had terrorized Allied bombers for years. They were spectacularly wrong about that assessment. and their mistake would cost the Luftwaffe thousands of experienced pilots who died believing they were superior right up until the moment American guns tore them apart. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been designed by a Russian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, who'd come to America in 1927 and decided to build the toughest, most powerful fighter plane anyone had ever seen. While other designers worried about weight and elegance, Kartveli focused on one simple question. How do you build a plane that can protect the pilot, carry enough firepower to destroy anything it hits, and still outperform enemy fighters where it matters most? His answer was the Thunderbolt, and everything about it was excessive by design. The fuselage was thick enough to house fuel tanks, ammunition, and armor plating that could stop 20mm cannon shells. The engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, more than any fighter engine in the world at that time. The wings were strong enough to mount 4 guns per side and still handle the stress of high-speed dives that would tear other planes apart. It wasn't pretty, but pretty doesn't win wars. What made the P-47 deadly wasn't agility or grace. It was pure, overwhelming firepower combined with engineering that turned physics into a weapon. Those 850 caliber machine guns were positioned in the wings, 4 per side, and when a pilot squeezed the trigger, every gun fired simultaneously, sending a stream of half-inch bullets downrange at 2,800 feet per second. Each bullet weighed almost 2 ounces and carried enough kinetic energy to punch through engine blocks, shred aluminum airframes, and turn cockpits into death traps. A 2-second burst put over 200 rounds into the air, creating a cone of destruction that was nearly impossible to fly through and survive. A 5-second burst, which pilots could sustain easily, meant 500 rounds of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition converging on a single target. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, built light and fast for maneuverability, couldn't survive that kind of punishment. Their thin aluminum skin might as well have been paper, and their fuel tanks, unprotected by the heavy armor American planes carried, would explode into fireballs when those 50 caliber rounds found them. American pilots who flew the P-47 described the experience of firing all 8 guns at once as feeling like the hand of God reaching out to smite their enemies. The recoil would actually slow the plane down, creating a noticeable deceleration that pilots had to compensate for, and the muzzle flash from 8 guns firing simultaneously would light up the cockpit even in broad daylight. Colonel Hub Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47s, told his pilots that if they could get their gun sight on a German plane and hold it there for just 2 seconds, that plane was dead, and he was right. The kill-to-hit ratio for P-47s was almost double that of other American fighters because when those 8 guns connected, there was no surviving it. But the P-47's real advantage came from altitude, and this is where German pilots kept dying before they understood what was happening. That heavy radial engine and massive airframe that looked so clumsy at low altitude became a devastating advantage above 25,000 feet, where the P-47's turbo supercharger gave it power that German fighters simply couldn't match. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were phenomenal fighters below 20,000 feet, where their lighter weight and tighter turning radius gave them an edge in traditional dogfighting. But above 25,000 feet, they started to struggle. Their engines lost power in the thin air, their controls became sluggish, and their climb rate dropped to almost nothing. The P-47, on the other hand, was just getting started. That turbo supercharger compressed thin high-altitude air and forced it into the engine, maintaining full power at altitudes where German planes were gasping for oxygen. The Thunderbolt could cruise comfortably at 30,000 feet, circle above German formations like a hawk over mice, then dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining perfect control. The diving speed was what really terrified German pilots once they figured out what was happening. A Messerschmitt in a full-speed dive could hit about 450 miles per hour before the controls locked up and the pilot had to pull out or risk the plane breaking apart. The P-47 could dive at 500 miles per hour and keep accelerating, and its massive weight actually became an advantage because gravity pulled it down faster than lighter planes could follow. German pilots would look up and see nothing but empty sky. Then suddenly American planes would be on them, diving from above at impossible speeds, guns firing, pulling up and climbing away before the Germans could even react. You couldn't outrun a diving P-47 because you physically couldn't dive fast enough to escape it. You couldn't outshoot it because by the time you got your guns pointed at it, the American pilot had already fired and was climbing away. Your only hope was to see it coming early and run, diving for the deck and praying you could reach the safety of clouds or ground-level terrain before those 8 guns found you. But by the time most German pilots figured that out, it was too late and they were already dead. The Americans built these monsters faster than Germany could replace the planes they lost. And this is where the war really turned against the Luftwaffe. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, produced one complete P-47 every 63 minutes during peak production in 1944. And the assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with workers on 3 shifts who understood that every plane they built meant American boys had a better chance of coming home alive. Women who'd never held a rivet gun before the war became expert aircraft builders, working through night shifts in freezing cold factories because their husbands and sons were overseas fighting, and they knew their work mattered. By the end of 1944, American factories had manufactured 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter of the entire war. Germany's total production of Messerschmitt Bf-109s from 1939 to 1945 was about 33,000 planes spread over 6 years. But they were fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously and losing them faster than they could build replacements. Every German pilot shot down over Europe was a pilot they couldn't replace in Russia or North Africa. Every Messerschmitt destroyed meant one less plane defending German cities from Allied bombers. The numbers got worse for Germany every month. In early 1943, the Luftwaffe could still field over 2,000 fighters on the Western Front. By mid-1944, that number had dropped to fewer than 800, and most of those were flown by inexperienced pilots with less than 50 hours of combat time. Meanwhile, American P-47 squadrons were growing larger and more experienced, with pilots who'd survived dozens of missions and knew exactly how to use their plane's advantages. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. They'd started the war believing they were the best trained, best equipped air force in the world, and for the first few years that belief had been justified. But by 1944, they were flying obsolete planes against overwhelming numbers of enemy fighters that were better in almost every measurable way, and they knew it. German ace pilot Johannes Steinhoff wrote in his diary after encountering P-47s over France in June 1944 that fighting them felt like being hunted by something that couldn't be killed, couldn't be escaped, and seemed to be everywhere at once. He described watching a P-47 take direct hits from a 20mm cannon that should have torn it apart, seeing pieces of the wing and fuselage blown away. Yet the American plane kept flying, kept fighting, and eventually shot down the German fighter that had damaged it. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter because everything about it was overbuilt and armored. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating thick enough to stop 20mm shells. The engine had armor protecting it from the front and sides. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning bullet holes would automatically close up before too much fuel leaked out. Pilots who limped home with engines smoking, hydraulics shot out, and hundreds of bullet holes in their airframes reported that the plane just kept flying. It wanted to bring them home, and it usually did. There are stories of P-47s returning to base with cylinders blown off their engines, with entire sections of wing missing, with tail surfaces shot to pieces, and the pilots would climb out and walk away without a scratch because the plane had protected them. One pilot landed with over 200 bullet and cannon holes in his aircraft, the engine barely running, and when maintenance crews examined the damage, they couldn't believe the plane had stayed in the air. But it had, and the pilot had shot down 2 German fighters on the way home before landing safely. That kind of survivability gave American pilots confidence that German pilots couldn't match. When you know your plane can take hits and keep flying, you fight more aggressively. When you know one good burst from the enemy will kill you, you fight more cautiously. The psychological advantage was just as important as the technical one. The statistics tell the brutal story of what happened when American industrial power met German desperation. P-47s destroyed 9,000 locomotives on the ground, cutting off German supply lines and leaving entire divisions without ammunition, fuel, or food. They destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, each one carrying supplies that German soldiers desperately needed. They destroyed 6,000 armored vehicles, including tanks that cost Germany months of production time and resources they couldn't afford to lose. But it was the air-to-air numbers that broke the Luftwaffe's back. 3,752 confirmed kills meant that on average, every single day for almost 2 years, P-47 pilots were shooting down more than 5 German planes. The sky that had belonged to the Luftwaffe since 1939 suddenly belonged to America, and there was nothing German pilots could do except watch their friends die and hope they weren't next. Every mission became a gamble. Every takeoff might be your last. The stress destroyed men who'd been flying combat missions for years, turned confident aces into nervous wrecks who flinched at shadows and jumped at every sound. By late 1944, German pilots were being sent into combat with less than 20 hours of flight training. Barely enough time to learn how to take off and land safely, let alone how to fight experienced American pilots flying superior planes. The Luftwaffe was throwing teenagers into cockpits and watching them die on their first missions because they had no other choice. Meanwhile, American pilots were cycling home after 50 missions, sharing their combat experience with new pilots in training, creating a system where knowledge and tactics improved with every generation. The Germans couldn't match that. They couldn't match the numbers. They couldn't match the technology. They couldn't match the industrial output. They were losing, and everyone knew it. But the war ground on anyway. Carl Weber survived his first encounter with P-47s, though barely, and the memory of that day haunted him for the rest of his life. He managed to dive away from the American fighters, pushing his Messerschmitt into a screaming descent that pulled 6 GS and nearly made him black out, barely escaping into a cloud bank before the Americans could line up another shot. He flew 43 more missions before Germany surrendered in May 1945, and every single time he climbed into his cockpit he remembered that morning in September when he'd laughed at the fat American fighters climbing toward him through the clouds. He never forgot how quickly his confidence had turned to terror when those planes dove and his wingman disappeared in a fireball. He never forgot the sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing at once, a sound that meant death was coming and there was nothing you could do to stop it. After the war, he told an American journalist that the worst sound he'd ever heard wasn't bombs falling on German cities or tanks firing at close range. It was the distinctive roar of 850 caliber machine guns opening up at once, because that sound meant someone was about to die and there was absolutely nothing you could do to save them or yourself. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that American engineering didn't need to be elegant or graceful. It just needed to work, needed to be built in overwhelming numbers, and needed to bring pilots home alive. The Germans called it the Jug as an insult, mocking its fat appearance and ungainly proportions. But American pilots wore that nickname as a badge of honor because their flying milk jugs ruled the skies over Europe and helped win the war. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the fastest or the prettiest. It's the one that shows up in numbers too big to fight and hits too hard to survive. The P-47 was exactly that weapon, and by the time the Luftwaffe figured out they'd mocked the wrong airplane, it was far too late to do anything about it. Thanks for watching another story from the WW2 Vault. Next week we're covering the day German tank crews realized their Panthers and Tigers weren't invincible anymore. And trust me, that story is just as brutal as this one. Hit that subscribe button so you're there when we drop it. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment telling us what WW2 story you want to hear next.